Well, hey everybody, thank you for checking in once again and welcome to another one. Well, now we've shot a great many vintage 50mm f2/f1.8 lenses on this channel, and I've been on something of a personal quest to find the nicest. In all that time, one lens has stood out above the rest. This lens has been my gold standard for vintage 50mm f2/f1.8s for many years, and it's the Carl Zeiss Jena Pancolar 50mm f1.8. But now there is a new pretender in town in the shape of this lens, and this is the Carl Zeiss Planar 50mm f1.7. So is this a better lens than the Pancolar? Can this knock the Pancolar off its top spot? And more importantly, is this a lens that you should be considering buying? To find out, stay tuned. So this lens really does have its work cut out if it's going to beat the Pancolar lens. The Pancolar makes some delicious images, and it really is an extraordinary optic. This is a really nice lens too, and we'll get into how it shoots in a moment. I've been shooting it over the past week, and what I've done with it, I've taken lots and lots of independent shots, single shots with this lens, but I've also taken identical shots with each lens, with this lens and with the Pancolar, so we can test on absolutely identical, or near as damn it identical shots. So that's what's coming up. Let me talk a little bit about the actual physicality of the lens first. The first thing that one notices is it's really light, and it's significantly lighter than the Pancolar, or I'm pretty sure it is anyway. Let's just take it off the adapter. So here are the two lenses side by side, and this one's the Pancolar, and it really is quite a bit heavier. So that's quite a surprise, and one reason for that, I think, is that there are plastic components used in this lens. The focus ring is pretty sure that's plastic. The aperture ring also, I'm pretty sure, is plastic, and it's a little bit clunky, a little bit. It's quite nice to turn, but it's a nicely made lens, it's a nicely feeling lens, but the plastic components, that really was quite a surprise. It's nice to see the T star on the lens there, indicating the Zeiss coatings, and I'll show you more closely in a moment. Yeah, and they're really lovely coatings, they really work well, and we'll see that when we get to the images. But I think, first of all, we'll have a look at the lens up close. So there's our lens, the Zeiss Planar 50mm f1.7, and you can see the purpley, greeny, bluey type coatings on there. Those are the T-star coatings, of which Zeiss are rightly and justly proud. I think they are very good coatings, as we'll see shortly, and they do a lot to damp down flaring and loss of contrast while you're shooting. So yeah, this was the budget level, the entry level lens in the Contax lineup. For the Contax RTS SLR, I believe you were pretty lucky to have one of those back in the day. And so we've got actually features that we really do find on quite cheap lenses, not something I'd expect on a Zeiss lens, because even though this was an entry-level lens, it still was an expensive lens, and they still are expensive. I paid £100 for this one just a little while ago. So printed, painted markings on the front plate there, printed and painted markings on the focus ring and on the aperture ring. So eventually those will wear off. I'm surprised to see them there, although I've got to say they have stood the test of time pretty well. There's the rear of the lens. The mount, I'm glad to say, is reassuringly metal, and I'm sure all the important bits are metal in this lens. Made in Japan. I know there was a a tie-up with Yashica at the time, and Yashica owned the Tomioka factory where all the Tomioka lenses were made, so I wonder if there's a connection with this lens there. It's a fairly small lens, it doesn't extend or retract too much, doesn't change its dimensions too much when you move it back and forth. This part's metal, so most of the important parts will almost certainly be metal. So there we are, that's the Contax, or rather the Zeiss Planar 50mm f 1.7. Oh, there's some crows arguing on the roof. Right, let's get into how this little optic shoots, and I'll tell you right now, straight from the outset, it shoots very, 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 very nicely indeed, and that's 4 veries on 1 indeed, so you can really be sure that's accurate. No, I am being serious. It really is a very, very nice little lens indeed, and it's certainly in the top tier of vintage 50mm f2/f1.8s, or in this case /f1.7s. I had a lot of fun shooting it. I wasn't quite sure what to expect, but as it turned out, it gave some very beautiful results, and I was very impressed, although there are 1 or 2 caveats, a couple of flaws and faults in this lens that might make you think twice, but we'll get to those shortly. Let's think about colour to begin with. Well, colour is really nice from this lens. Colours are, what can I say? I think they're, I'm wanting to use the word restrained, and they can be restrained. They can be quite low key depending on the lighting and the conditions, and they can indeed almost be a little muted at times. But at other times, this lens really changes. If you get bright sunlight and bright colours, then my goodness, it will really give you some pop. These colours really have some energy and some kick. However, it's not a lens that presents sort of cartoonish colours. It is very, very nicely balanced, and I must admit, the engineers at Zeiss clearly have put a lot of thought and a lot of care into how images from this lens should look. It's very nicely tuned, it's very nicely balanced, colours are absolutely beautiful. It shoots, I think, just a little cooler than the Pancolar. I think the Pancolar images are just very slightly warmer. That could be to do with the coatings, could be to do with the glass, could be to do with any number of things. You'll see in the identical shots that I've shot that the Pancolar does look just a little bit warmer than the images from this lens. So colours are very, very nicely balanced. They can feel a little restrained. They can give loads of pop in the right light. So it really has a sort of a repertoire. It really has a wide vocabulary, if you like, a wide visual vocabulary, at least in terms of colour. Now then, the lens has very, very nice contrast. That helps to support the colour. I wouldn't call it a very high contrast lens, but I certainly wouldn't call it a low contrast lens either. It sits somewhere in the middle, and it knows what contrast it is. It doesn't change very much according to light. So you can have very, very strong sunlight, very, very harsh shadows, and the Zeiss seems to moderate those shadows a little, just to make them a little paler, just to bring that, what could be a very high contrast scene, down just a little bit. Conversely, it can give a muted sort of contrast, but it never goes too low, and this lens is very well protected against loss of contrast from shooting with the sun in the frame. You know, you get the sun in your frame and it'll catch the lens and boom, suddenly all your contrast drops out. This lens is very, very good at resisting that. Probably a little better than the Pancolar, I think. There isn't too much in it. It also makes some really groovy lens flares, not quite as good as the Canon new FD 51.4. That's the lens flare king for me, but this does come a close second. It makes some very cool flares indeed. Right, let's talk about sharpness. Well, all I can say here is look out or you might cut yourself. It really is an incredibly sharp lens, and I'm going to say now, this lens has beaten the Pancolar for sharpness. It is just that little bit sharper. I didn't want to admit it. The Pancolar has been on the top spot for sharpness for many years, so I really was reluctant to give the crown to this newcomer, but I have to admit, looking at these side-by-side images, and these are shot wide open, by the way, looking at those side-by-side images, I've got to admit this is a sharper lens. It's only a little bit sharper, but small improvements when we're getting better and better and better in lens quality. Remember, tiny improvements are really hard to do. They become harder and harder to do as you approach theoretical perfection. So that's a real triumph. To make a lens sharper than the vintage lens, sharper than the CZJ Pancolar, is a real triumph. And you know, I've got to admit it, this lens is sharper. And if sharpness is your criteria for a lens, this one is better than the Pancolar. If it isn't, there are many other things to consider, and I wouldn't rate a lens purely on sharpness, but I've got to admit, this one's sharper than the Pancolar. Check out the side-by-side images, and it's there plain as daylight, even though I really didn't want it to be, but it is. The sharpness of this lens is extraordinary. It approaches a modern lens for sharpness, even wide open. Were it not for the background blur, which we'll come to, you might well mistake this one for a modern lens. It's that sharp. Stop it down to f4 or even f8 and it becomes razor sharp, and I really doubt you could distinguish it from a modern in sharpness when you stop it down a little bit. That's how sharp it is. It's the sharpest vintage 50 I've ever shot. All right, let's consider background blur from each of these lenses, and I'll tell you straight away, I prefer the blur from the Pancolar. The Pancolar preserves just a little bit of the Zeiss swirl that we first saw in the Biotar in the 1930s, and which is probably best known from the Helios 44 and the Helios 40 lenses. They're real swirlers. And what happens is the cat's eye shapes, specular highlights rather, bubbles from point light sources around in the centre, and they go kind of cat's eye shapes, ellipse shapes at the edges and at the corners, and you get this impression of swirling around the edge of the shot. Not everyone's cup of tea. I rather like it. The Carl Zeiss Jena engineers did not fully engineer out the swirl. Maybe they liked it too. The Zeiss engineers, the Western Zeiss engineers, did fully engineer it out. Or maybe it's just a totally different optical formula from the Biotar formula, I don't know. But try as I might, and I wanted to make it swirl, I could not make this lens swirl. I thought I saw it in one or two shots, and I thought, yes, we've got some nice blur here, but no, we didn't, we haven't. I didn't see it. I was imagining things. The truth of the matter is, it doesn't have any coherence to it. It's all over the place. It's a bit of a mess, actually. It really is a bit of a mess. Thinking about bubbles from point light sources. Some of them are circular in the centre, but near the centre we get ellipses. And then we'll get an ellipse over here that's turned this way, and then we'll get an ellipse over here that's turned this way. And so there isn't any coherence in any of it. It just seems to be a big mishmash and just to have fallen out the way it's fallen out, and you know, to work the way it just happens to work. Background blur was not a big deal in the 1970s and the 1980s. It wasn't, at least it wasn't quite the same deal that it is now. Nowadays we do evaluate these lenses for background blur, but at the time, you know, quality of blur, bokeh as they call it now, wasn't really that much considered, at least not from my memory. And I've heard other old school photographers say that too. So it probably wasn't so much of a thing back in the day, but now I've got to say it really is a bit of a mess. It's all over the place, it's not coherent, and it's certainly not as pleasant to look at as the Pancolar blur, although it is nice. It's not unpleasant as such, it's just not particularly pleasing. So a definite win for the Pancolar there. And it's a similar story with chromatic aberration. This lens, the Zeiss Planar 50mm f1.7, shot wide open, is one of the worst lenses for chromatic aberration and the purpley fringy stuff that you see, for example, around tree branches shot against the sky. It happens because apparently different colours, different wavelengths of light focus at different points on the film or the sensor. Now it might be because I'm shooting this digitally, I don't know, I've never shot one of these on film, so I don't know. So it might be a quirk of shooting on a digital sensor. The lens wasn't really designed for that. However, I've got to say, chromatic aberration is awful if you shoot this lens wide open. It really is flipping awful. It doesn't bother me that much. Chromatic aberration in lenses doesn't bother me too much, but with this lens it did begin to bother me because it's just so visible. It's everywhere. You shoot this wide open and you're going to see the purpley fringes. So definitely a win for the Pancolar there, which focuses each wavelength of light much more efficiently and much better and brings them to very nearly the same point on the sensor. So a far better performance by the Pancolar, you know, a really bad performance by the Zeiss Planar. This is a case of you know, must do better, see me, take 100 lines. It's a really poor performance for chromatic aberration. Rarely have I seen a lens so bad for chromatic aberration shot wide open. I believe it does go away when you stop it down, but wide open, it's very, very obvious. So, which is the best lens? What's the conclusion? Which one am I going to keep? And more importantly, perhaps, should you buy the Carl Zeiss Planar 50mm f1.7? Well, I have to say that these two lenses are within an ace of each other, optically speaking. There really isn't very much in it. It beats the Pancolar on sharpness. Where is it? Come here, lens. This lens beats the Pancolar on sharpness. There's no doubt about it. I didn't want it to be true, but it really is. This is a sharper lens certainly than my Carl Zeiss Jena Pancolar 51.8. So it wins on sharpness. Colour is a little different, but that's subjective. Which do I prefer? Very hard to say. I like them both. It's very hard to say. I'm not sure I could choose. It's a subjective thing. I'd have to live with this lens a little bit longer and compare it a bit more before I could say. But you can see there clearly is a difference in colour, and whether you get the Pancolar or the Planar, that's going to depend on your subjective preference. This lens, the Planar, loses on chromatic aberration to the Pancolar, and it loses on the quality of its background blur, although that again is a subjective thing. Not everybody likes the swirl. So we're left with two lenses that really are very, very close optically, that can't really be told apart if you stop them down it far enough, but I guess that's true of any lens. They're very, very nearly as sharp as each other, but the Zeiss has rather poor chromatic aberration performance wide open. Now, I do have to say my CZJ Pancolar lens really is a little bit past its best. It's not of the same quality that it was when it left the Jena factory in, I think, probably the late 80s sometime. I'll tell you why that is. The aperture mechanism needs looking at. It's sometimes not picking up the blades and opening them and closing them properly. That is a weakness in CZJ lenses, but the aperture was never quite right on this lens. When I bought the lens, it was full of mould and fungus. I had to clean it out with vinegar, which I did, and it performed very nicely after that. But it's clearly a lens that has led a hard life, so it may have faults and flaws that it shouldn't have, that it's picked up over its 50-odd year lifespan. So it might be that this lens, my Pancolar, is not the best example of the breed. Nevertheless, this is the one we've got, and that is the one we will go with. So which is the better lens? Is this Planar better than the Pancolar? Well, yes and no. It's certainly sharper, but it certainly has more chromatic aberration. You may or may not prefer the background blur, and you may or may not prefer the colour. So this has to be personal preference, because they're really so close. Whichever you choose, that's got to be your personal preference. As for me, which will I sell on? Which will I keep? I don't know. I honestly don't know at this point. I'm wondering if this is a better lens than the Pancolar. I like the Pancolar very much. It's a lens that I have a lot of attachment to, and if I do keep it, that will probably be the reason, attachment. I may just keep it and get it serviced, but we'll see. I'll use this one a little more and make the decision. But one thing is certain. If you do buy this Zeiss Planar, which costs around about £100 to £150, they're not particularly cheap as vintage 50s go. They're cheap for a lens, but not particularly cheap for a vintage 50. But I think you do get what you pay for here, if you can live with the purpley fringy stuff that it gives. If you don't mind it not having swirl in the background blur, and you're not looking for anything particularly what can I say, particularly coherent in your background blur, then this could well be the lens for you. This is not a bad choice. In fact, it's one of the nicest 50s I've shot. So if you do buy this lens, it's a very, very beautiful optic. It makes nicer images than most of the 50s I've shot, and it really is a very nice optic indeed. The final choice, that's got to be down to you. So, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, that is about it from me for this week. I've had a great time shooting this Carl Zeiss Planar, and I'll be bringing you more lens reviews next week, so stay tuned. Many, many thanks for watching, and if you've watched this far, many, many thanks to you, particular thanks to you. Many, many thanks go to subscribers for your support. I'm very, very grateful for that support. It really does mean a lot. If you've liked this episode, if you like this channel, if you like the work we're doing, why not give us a sub? That will help the channel to grow and help me to bring you more content. It would also be very much appreciated. Many, many thanks go to patrons for your support. And without that support, I've said this before, but it's absolutely true, without that support, I could not make this show in the way that I do. So many, many thanks for that. If you like this show and you think we're doing good work here, again, you might want to become a patron yourself. You can do that for as little as $1 per week, and you can do it over at www.patreon.com/Zenography. But as for me, that's it for now. So if you're not doing anything too bothersome, irritating, or irksome next week at around this time, please do check in and join me for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.